After thousands of hours in this game, I wanted to rank every exotic weapon's strength in PvE for Destiny 2, from the F tier options not worth your time all the way up to the most elite in the game. I spent a good amount of time testing each one, consulting some of the game's best players in the game for a well-rounded list, and then worked with my community to put this video together. We looked at a weapon's individual strengths, how widely you can use them, so like how many activities they're viable in, and then still made sure to consider unique traits that exotics bring to the table in justifying their place in that ever valuable exotic slot that you have. Whether you're here to see what's worth buying from the kiosk or just to defend your favorite gun's honor, you've come to the right place. Now, starting with the F tier, these are guns with an incredibly fringe use case, or they're just straight up outclassed by other legendary weapons not taking up your exotic slot. Starting out is Salvation's Grip. Its main use is a hyper niche speedrun tech that allows you to teleport after dying. I'm seriously opening up with that line because outside of that, it's just straight up worse than other regular grenade launchers. Believe me, even this blue one in collections is better thanks to the auto-loading perk. Fighting Lion. Now to the fans out there, don't get mad at me. You have to admit it, this one's unfortunately a bit of a relic. It's never been top tier in PvE and it keeps getting punished for wanting to exist in PvP. The exotic perk is that dealing damage makes its reload stat higher than 0. You have to get kills with a different weapon to refill its magazine, and it's a primary grenade launcher in a game where special ammo rains from the sky. I'm so sorry, but we're moving on. Edge of Intent. This is an exotic glaive that only warlocks can equip without any of the good glaive perks that legendaries can get. Now let me just check my notes and confirm that it commits all of its resources to making one healing turret. On a class famous for its already wildly overpowered healing, you can do better. Mida Multi-Tool lets you walk and sprint 10% faster. That's only while you're holding it though. Now I guess you do get plus 20 to your mobility, just like all the other lightweight legendaries give you. It won't let you go over 100 mobility, and then stacking other movement stuff maxes out around 12% movement speed anyway. Like in today's day and age, we've kind of just moved past using Mida Multi-Tool for movement, and it's not one of the better scout rifles for PvE regardless. With the first section done, we're going to move on to D tier for some slightly better options. From this point on, I'd say everything has a very clear purpose that stands out, and while it might sound bad to land here, it's not always the case. A lot of these guns have great potential, but they're either victims of a wide sandbox right now or are currently just outclassed by other weapons, whether it's exotics higher up in this list or still a few legendaries. Edge of Concurrence. This is a hunter-only glaive with a really cool alt-fire that can be a menace in PvP, but in PvE, however, it's like taping Forbearance, a really popular waveframe grenade launcher, onto the end of a stick and then only being allowed to use it with a 1-minute cooldown. On to the next one. Heart Shadow's whole shtick is that it's an assassin weapon. Come out of invis, do a load of burst damage, and go back to being invis again. The one catch is that its burst damage is a bit worse than most other things and requires you to be at point blank range. Plus, the only enemies that are still alive after doing the burst damage are usually bosses. I think we all know what happens if you stay too close to a boss for too long. Even if you're invisible, they tend to want to stomp you after a while. Worldline Zero is a bit of a hero to me, it's almost like that one walked just so that the Eager Edge perk could run. You know, the perk that sends you flying? Bungie literally buffed Worldline with that in the game now, just so that it could zoom twice as much, but it still doesn't really have much of a reason to exist. It's not a great damage weapon, not as good of a movement weapon, now it's just pretty to look at. Please Bungie, show my Worldline some love. The Black Talon lives and dies by the viability of caster frame swords. Right now, not very viable, and with heavy attacks now counting as full even without full guard energy, there's no real workaround. I could see a big caster frame buff shifting this up to a higher place on the list, but as of today, it's kind of rough out there for PvE. The Queenbreaker is an exotic that exists. Moving on. I'm just kidding, it's a heavy linear fusion intended for utility rather than outright damage, mainly blinding enemies. It's actually the fastest firing linear fusion we have with a 300 millisecond charge time. I mean, if you want to combine the utility of two special weapons and throw them into an exotic heavy weapon that only kind of halfway works, then Queenbreaker is great for you. But if you want something that simply does the job better, well, you're gonna find out later in this list. The Prospector, you know what? Let's just show this clip because this is pretty sweet. I almost put it in the S tier just for this. The colony is actually a pretty good exotic in concept. If it was stronger, it could really hang in the current sandbox. The idea is you shoot the ground or a wall, or I guess anything really, and it'll just release enemy-seeking nanites that'll explode when they find one. It even auto-reloads while you're not using it. The reality is that it's just overshadowed by guns like Gallarhorn in the same role. I will say that if Bungie considerably upped the damage and ammo total for this, the colony could end up much higher in the list. Deterministic Chaos is another one with a strong concept. It's designed to be a mix between the tractor cannon and collective obligation. While the former applies a massive debuff to an enemy, this one's going to do a little bit less in exchange for giving it the ability to do an okay amount of damage during that debuff. Comparing it to the collective obligation, it's got a much easier setup, hence why it goes in the heavy slot. The main thing is that the frequency that the special bullets activate on this is too low for its rate of fire. The mag is too small, and the weaken debuff is just not quite strong enough or widely available. In the correct circumstance, it can definitely shine, but without that, you have a machine gun that's honestly worse than most legendaries. I really think there's good bones to this one, it's just struggling a bit in the current sandbox. Now, the truth is a rocket launcher with insanely strong tracking. It's got 3 rockets in the mag, which is a beautiful thing, and detonates based on proximity to enemies. It's very, very hard to miss with this thing. One unfortunate catch is that the early detonation also means your rockets will deal less damage than every other rocket in the game. Couple that with enemies not being super mobile to justify the tracking in most cases, and not getting access to Wolfpack rounds like legendary rockets do when your teammate uses Gallarhorn, you end up laying down in the D tier. Skyburner's Oath has a pretty unique use case in that it can actually trigger ignitions without any kills at all. My hunters out there understand how special this is when you combine it with the weighted knife. It has a unique property that when it hits a scorched target, it'll automatically ignite them, and that ability to scorch targets on demand from the get-go, not needing a kill, actually synergizes really well with the subclass elements. Honestly, this is a pretty good example of what I mean by a fringe use case scenario, and it's just not massively valuable to dedicate to your exotic slot right now. Lord of Wolves straight up does not have the ammo it needs to survive. You could argue that this is a great mid-range version of the Fourth Horseman, especially one with split pellets that can take on groups, but as it stands, it's both too weak and has nowhere enough ammo to actually keep you going in PvE. Hardlight has 3 firing types: Arc, Solar, and Void. This was always handy when dealing with different shield elements, of course, but now that the match game modifier is gone, it's feeling a bit lost in PvE. I will say I appreciate that Bungie updated its exotic perk to give the elemental capacitor buff a while ago, but that's not really doing much for it on this side anyways. Moving on, we've got Darcy, and it's actually not that bad. It's just not that amazing either. You see, the game originally launched with traditional special ammo weapons sitting in the heavy slot. Because of that, there's a few weapons out there, like Darcy, that sort of stand out feeling like they don't belong in the slot. I would say that the Whisper of Worm, which we're going to talk about later, has evolved to fit that slot. Darcy has not. There was an update a while back that gave it the ability to jolt targets after highlighting them in your scope, which was kind of cool, leaning into the idea that it could be an ad clear sniper in the heavy slot, or maybe an easy way to apply jolt for boss damage, but then Bungie turned around and nerfed jolt damage. D tier for now. Devil's Ruin. The neat thing about this is that it's unlike a lot of other alt fire guns, you know, like when you have 2 different firing modes. This one actually feels really smooth. There's no special reload, no kill requirement, no certain amount of bullets needed in the mag or anything like that. You can fire 14 shots and then just hold that trigger down for a full laser beam. This means when you want to use that unstoppable laser, you can just use it right away. Honestly, thinking about it more, it's kind of like a perfect blueprint on how a lot of these alt fire modes should actually work. That being said, the fact that it's tied to the current sidearm archetype that it is, it's just not really shining. With other options out there outclassing this one, we're going to move to the Manticore. This one's kind of neat, but also a weird one. Every so often, a build video will show up that makes it seem like it's really, really cool, and then you actually use it, and you're kind of like, yeah, okay, maybe. It's stronger than a standard SMG, but weaker than every special ammo void option. It's definitely good when you pair it with something like a volatile Gerfalcon's build, but it has a slower fire rate than something like the Wave Splitter. You do get damage resist in the air, but are way less likely to need it if you're just on the ground or invisible. It's a bit of a messy exotic when you think about it, considering you need enemies around to keep its actual in-air utility going, when you might have just been better off on the ground with something else. Teraba is one of my favorites in the game, just on the PvP side. With respect to PvE, it's outdone in most areas, and while the supercharged version is extremely fun, like seriously, it's so fun, it just really feels disappointing when you don't have it, especially when there's other exotics that just feel good all the time. I still love you in PvP though, bro. Borealis, similar to Hardlight, this one's a bit of a victim due to the disappearance of the match game modifier. Its core concept is a shield breaker, and with built-in Genesis, it's something that can keep churning out shots back to back, not to mention getting the benefits of Elemental Capacitor while you're at it. Unfortunately, Bungie's game design is sort of leaning away from Elemental Shields in general, and so outside of being a great stat monster sniper, it's not really a competitor. X-Dearest, the one with infinite special ammo. Shots appear directly in the mag, meaning you never reload it, yet Bungie still gave it a reload stat of 69. Every 4 kills makes it shoot faster, which is great in theory, but a little disorienting in practice. The kills also spawn an Arc Moth on a 4-second cooldown, spreading some blinding effects to the area as you use it. For any hunters out there, this actually combos really well with the Mothkeeper's Wraps exotic, spawning an Overshield Moth at the same time. Ultimately though, still a bit of a fringe use case, and it isn't like the best, most elite thing at any one thing that it does. I still think it's pretty cool though that it's infinitely regenning your special, which is something we hadn't really seen since the Icebreaker of D1. Also, videos of this size and detail aren't typically possible without the help of a sponsor, so I wanted to say thanks to War Thunder. As a free-to-play military MMO, they have the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and it's now cross-platform, available on both PC and consoles. With over 140 maps representing historical battle theaters, you can play up to 10 nations using over 2,500 kinds of tanks, planes, helicopters, ships, you name it. With over 70 million players in PvP, it's the ultimate virtual military experience because of how sophisticated the vehicle damage is. Instead of basic hitboxes, you actually damage the individual components of the vehicle, like the engine or fuel tanks, weapon attachments, etc. It makes it really interactive, especially with how gorgeous the graphics are in 4K. And for limited time, using my link in the pinned comment, you'll get a bonus pack with the exclusive Eagle of Valor decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account, all of which applies to both new and players returning from a 6-month period. Symmetry. This one feels like it's ripe for a buff, but Bungie's been pretty clear that they've been trying to move away from the scout rifle gameplay that we used to have ages ago. For something that focuses on chaining precision hits at long range, then ramping up to do good close quarters splash damage is actually a great hybrid that'd match this idea. Buffing that close quarters damage of the Arc Seeker mode could really make this a great option for high level content too. Until then, it lies in its bed. Vex Caliber. This is a super unique, and I'm sorry to say, super bad exotic. As content gets harder in this game, the glaive melee gets a little bit less effective over time. In fact, it can eventually become outright dangerous to even try and pull off unless you know exactly what you're doing. Vex Caliber's identity revolves around maintaining a slither of overshield to buff melees that ultimately still don't quite do enough damage. You can trigger some overshield synergies on Titan, but only safely out of combat, which kind of begs the question, why? This thing's got potential, just not quite enough of it right now, especially with the fact that Vex Caliber splitting the glaive shot into a shotgun spread kind of takes away the ranged element that makes glaives strong in the first place. Deadman's Tail, an exotic that's been reworked so many times it's hard to keep track of what it actually does. Right now, it's a fast-firing hip-fire scout with a very slow total reload. Consecutive headshots give a bit of a damage buff, maxing out at 16%. I still do love using this thing just because of the look and feel of it, but outside of really niche speed runs like a solo headlong maybe that require pinpoint hipfire accuracy against very weak enemies, I would say it doesn't really have a place in PvE. On the same train of thought, let's talk about the Vigilance Wing, Jade Rabbit, Suros Regime, and Chaperone. 4 exotics that were all clearly intended for PvP and very little to write home about outside of that context. They're all pretty well-rounded, and I guess you could say they would benefit of some kind of PvE-focused perk, but as they are, I've just grouped these together as pretty much PvP-based. No Time to Explain is another one that people would immediately think PvP due to its strength in the Crucible, but it can be fun in PvE too. Getting to create a little turret that hovers around your weapon is a lot of fun, and when you pair it with Arc Souls, it's kind of like a match made in heaven. It lets you stack some passive damage over time options while also using other things on your build, but it's still a bit outclassed by other options in this list higher up. Next up, we've got my 77k. This one is held back by the things keeping it in line for PvP. Basically, they have to be really careful with this one to not make it been an absolute nightmare in the Crucible. An example of that is you can't just build up and save your freeze shot for later. You have to charge it then and there, and then use the shot before swapping weapons. I think because of this, it's still sort of struggling to find its footing as a cool stop button for unstoppable champions. And while I don't think it feels bad, it just definitely leaves you wondering if there's better options out there for the role, which there are. The last word is, yeah, I guess I'm just really on a train of PvP talk right now, aren't I? For the PvE side of the game, I would love to see Bungie give this thing like 4 times the charm or something. It would give it a crazy synergy with Lucky Pants, and it might not hurt PvP either. As it stands though, they always have to be careful, and this is more of a cosplay gun than anything else in this realm. Rat King is, I don't even know what to say. It's a bit of a meme. It has some extremely niche cases, like everyone swapping to it when they're out of ammo in a day 1 raid, or just getting funny clips because the damage isn't actually that bad at all. The reality, however, is that other primaries do better damage now, and Rat King isn't really the king necessity now, directly helping with a lot of the invisible synergies out there. Due to all of this, I've got it in D tier with a few more before we move on to the next section. The Sturm relies on another weapon called Drang. The synergy between these two weapons is rather fantastic, but that same reliance is what really hampers this one. There was a role a long time ago that this filled very well, which was just having a quick one-shot kill on medium strength enemies. Over the course of the game evolving though, that's been getting filled by other stuff like Buried Bloodline, Ariana's Vow, the Forerunner, or even the new rocket pistols. What I can say is that Sturm is a primary that can do around sniper rifle levels of damage very quickly in a hand cannon form. That definitely feels great, but you're required to be running a specific sidearm to do this, so it's sort of like a 2-slot situation. Definitely a relic of Year 1 Destiny 2. The Crimson actually feels pretty decent in gameplay, but the niche that it's built around is starting to be both less important and more widely spread across other things in the game. Multi-shot hand cannons like Warden's Law, for example, pair fantastically with Lucky Pants. Other healing options like Restoration, Cure, Devour, Heal Clip, like the list just goes on. Ace of Spades was pretty special when it released, as it was the only weapon to come with the perk Firefly at that time. This crazy strong perk in Destiny 1, which returned to Destiny 2 as a reined-in version called Dragonfly. I think Bungie knew that Dragonfly wasn't as great and even let you use a weapon mod called Dragonfly Spec to help out with that. After a while came along the Ace of Spades rolling Kill Clip and the original explosion of the D1 Firefly perk. This was 6 years ago now though, which kind of, wow, I'm getting old. The reality is we've got a number of weapons with that Firefly perk now coming full circle. It's a fine gun, but it's a product of its time. Finishing our D tier is the Wishkeeper, a great suspend tool. I say great because suspending enemies is great, but only if you have something that can actually kill them after they're suspended. The Wishkeeper is kind of on the weak end of bows and doesn't end up being the greatest pairing you can come up with. I was a bit torn between D and C because you can have some utility if you want to suspend things while not on a strand class, but as it stands, I still think there's much better options out there. Let's talk about the C tier weapons. These are guns with better specific use cases than the ones we've been talking about, but they struggle in justifying that oh so special exotic slot. Some of these perform a single purpose quite well, but in uncommon situations, or they're noticeably elevated with certain builds, but not to the extent that B tier ones can be. The Wardcliff Coil is our first example of excelling in an uncommon setting. It is extremely strong within its niche in that it can do huge burst damage to enemies classed as vehicles or constructs. Of course, you can use it on bosses and easily demonstrate it inside of footage, but the real shine of it comes with unique things like those fuses in Deepstone Crypt, Shrieker bosses, or specific wizards like the ones in Shattered Throne. These types of bosses might feel like they're everywhere, but they're actually not. They're mostly tied to the activity that they exist within. From a well-rounded overall game perspective, the Wardcliff really doesn't get much mileage. The more encounters that continue to be added to the game where this niche isn't really needed as much, the more its use gets tapered down. The 1000 Voices, otherwise known as 1K, is actually pretty good on paper. Combining it with Ember of Ashes means you're getting an ignition off with every shot, which really piles up for overall damage, but that's just another example of how it can excel in an incredibly unique case. The reserves buff that it just got is honestly pretty great, it just feels a little clunky to use in regular gameplay. A common complaint I've heard from friends who are a bit newer to the game really struggle about that long charge time. If an enemy is fast approaching them, they tend to just blow themselves up. Now the 1K has had a ton of buffs over the last like 9 seasons, so it continues to cross my mind as viable options, and if we did get a seasonal mod like that one back in season 15, I think it was, Particle Deconstruction, this would become a serious contender thanks to that 40% damage buff. But those are seasonal and this is more of an overall thing. Okay, Deathbringer. It's really weird. It looks great, feels great, the visual effects are really great, and the damage is great, and yet it's completely outclassed. That might sound like the weapons in D tier, but it does belong in C tier because it has so much potential. Right now, the problem is that there's a limit on the number of active void orbs that do damage, which is low enough that even 2 people using this at the same time can hamper each other. If that limit were to ever be fixed per se, this could become extremely strong against bigger targets in longer DPS phases. Winterbite had a lot of fun when it was first released, nuking everything. Right now, it's got a bit of a hill to climb just to justify its slot though. It's undeniably the strongest melee glaive, as it should be, taking up both an exotic and your heavy slot. The freezing orb it fires is quite interesting, but for me, leaning into the pretty respectable freezing melee damage is the way to get the most mileage out of this thing, but then at that point, are you hampering your ranged potential by giving up your heavy slot? Edge of Action being in C tier is higher than most of you might expect. However, its niche is incredibly unique and has seen viability in a number of places already. Using your glaive energy, you can create a mini Titan bubble, which actually gives many versions of the same benefits. A lot of people like to proc offensive bulwark from it to buff their melee, but its primary use has been shattering stasis crystals inside of it. The combination of bubble and crystals is really fun, and it's also super important to note that it's used in a number of speed runs due to the extra 5% weapon damage that the bubble now gives you. That might not seem like a lot on paper, but it does actually go a long way. Truthfully speaking here, the utility potential of this just can't be denied, even if it's an exotic glaive. Trespasser is an arc sidearm. In the middle of your gameplay, it's a little clunky to get the max uptime on that exotic perk, the super burst if you will, and while having that active is good, it suffers from the same pitfalls as Teraba. In most activities, it's better than Teraba, just not by a huge mile. With new weapons out there like the Indebted Kindness rocket pistol that everyone's been crushing Onslaught with, it just absolutely gets suppressed into the C tier. Tommy's Matchbook. On one hand, this is one of the coolest looking guns in the game. On the other hand, dear God, is it weak. The fact that it can ignite targets all on its own just by shooting them for long enough is pretty darn cool. What it hides from you though is that the ignition damage scales by the damage source. What this means is that your piddly little primary damage is putting out these deceptively huge explosions that actually deal the same damage as, burning your hand on a stove. Something that really hurts for that split second, but then you're fine. A little too weak compared to the top end guns in this video. Now, Centrifuge has a really great run-and-gun feel that actually buffs the gun when you lean into it. Sprinting and sliding makes it stronger, and then after doing it for honestly a pretty short time, it basically gets a blinding version of Chain Reaction. The weird situation with Centrifuge is that all of these things are existing perks and fragments that you can kind of spec into while using other weapons anyways. You could definitely make the argument that Centrifuge gives a lot of the biggest benefits while not being on arc, but with its best performance being tied to amplified, you don't really want to. A little too use case for me. Polaris Lance, an exotic that saw a lot of use back in Season 23 due to some very generous Radiant and Ignition artifact mods. It was a staple for slow and steady Grandmaster teams that wanted to sit back and kind of plink-plonk everything in sight. With the fact that those were seasonal mods, they are now gone, and you're back to needing between 8 to 12 precision shots for an Ignition, and the Lance is back to being pretty flaccid. Ruinous Effigy is an exotic that I wanted to place higher. I really did. It's incredibly fun. The slam dunk is super neat, but it's just worse than Wave Splitter. I'm so sorry in like every way. It does less damage, the dunk puts you out of position, and the healing and debuff using the orb requires you to be actively doing it for almost no reward. In a time before Void Souls, class-wide Devour uses, and orbs being printed out the wazoo nowadays, Ruinous actually did have a really solid place. A tier fun factor, C tier reality. Delicate Tomb. This thing's good. It's good enough that I feel like it should even be higher. The interesting choices by Bungie are the fact that its synergies are only incremental bonuses. Extra ionic traces and jolt are already baked into the Arc subclass and widely available through other fragments, aspects, or even other exotic armors. Delicate Tomb isn't quite the cherry on top of a sundae. It's a little more like the base of the sundae, and it's just not super exotic to me. Duality is unique in that it's widely seen as a PvP weapon, despite its exotic perk really only applying to PvE. On Black Wings increases slug precision damage after getting kills in the buckshot mode. And it's actually pretty good. Like, we're talking around a 30% buff after just 2 kills, all the way up to 55% coming from 5. That damage buff also refreshes its timer after each precision hit. Now, don't get me wrong, I know this is very niche, but those numbers are big numbers, especially for a slug that can get multiple shots in. I really struggled on where to put this thing exactly, but it still felt a little too fringe case. Cloud Strike, another really cool exotic. It's best used against big bosses like Oryx, where the repeated splash damage can actually still hit them, as part of like a wider damage rotation with stuff like rockets or Cascade Point GLs. Even then though, it struggles to compete. In most cases, the Cloud Strike needs an dense world where you can pick things off at range without being flinched off. I might be biased, I'm just personally a bit more of a run and gun style player, and so this just doesn't live in that world for me. Sweet Business. Oh man, this thing is super funny. It doles out a lot of damage once you get it going, and it's incredibly stable. A little frustrating requiring an ammo pickup to reload, or dedicating your dodge or exotic to it often hurts more than it helps. You got to admit though, when it's going, it is going. The spin up just leaves you a little too vulnerable for a little too long. Cerberus +1 is a genuine surprise. I'm not going to cover range specifics, just know that it's a mid-range gun that does less damage outside of that range, both too close and too far. You want to be mid-range with this thing, and for that reason, it's going to feel really good for some players, but really bad for others. It can shred certain enemies and perform pretty respectably. It's also the only gun that behaves exactly this way. I think there's a bit of an acquired taste to it though. Like, I recommend you give it a shot. You might love it, you might hate it. Wicked Implement. This one's got pretty good bones where the synergies make a lot of sense. Despite it being very, very weak, it feels pretty good to use with the fact that it buffs your stasis shards. Like, that's a huge win in a lot of builds. The reason it wound up in C tier rather than some of the more build-defined cousins in B tier is that when you're looking at stasis builds, for example, it's not the best choice. Bad Juju, the exotic of super energy. It's far from its glory days of being one of the best options for that now, but there's still a couple areas where it can help you out. If we look away from that diminishing fact, you'll see that each kill gives the Bad Juju a stacking 20% damage buff up to double damage at 100%, with every kill reloading your magazine. That's honestly really strong and kind of overlooked. It's basically like a pulse rifle version of the Huckleberry if you think about it. Still some better options out there, but I truly do enjoy using this one. Touch of Malice, a fan favorite that's almost right in so many ways, well described by my buddy Nomad in this video. You can continually shoot the final round in the mag, doing more than double damage at the cost of your health. If you have something like Devour, or you're in a healing well of some kind, you can easily maintain these high damage shots. After getting 10 crits, you can then shoot a blinding Taken Blight, which also debuffs your enemies to take 50% more damage from Weapons of Sorrow. If you're picking up what I'm laying down, we're kind of describing a very niche case, and there's only a select few primaries, including the Touch of Malice, that fall under that category of Weapons of Sorrow. Still pretty neat if you've run out of ammo though in a boss fight and you need to take them down at the end. Final warning, the highest sustained DPS primary, if you can hit all of your crits at close range. A pretty big caveat. Caveat? If successful though, it can take a place as a day 1 damage primary option. That's going down a bit of a rabbit hole though, so I'll just summarize by saying Final Warning is a pretty strong sidearm that can do big chunks of damage to enemies, and the burst fire mode hits like a truck. Some competition for this are the fact that we now have rocket pistols. Traveler's Chosen, the one that gives you a consistent way to regain all of your abilities while buffing itself along the way. This is super strong on paper. The catch is mainly the fact that so many similar synergies already exist, especially with different builds and mod setups nowadays, that dedicating your exotic weapon slot, something very important, can feel like a bit of a waste on this. I think a damage buff correlating to how many stacks you have in the chamber could really help this guy out. We haven't talked about PvP weapons in a while, so let's mention the Hawk Moon. I don't care what anyone says, this one can hang in PvE. As hilarious as it may be getting a 1736% damage increase, and yes, that isn't just off the cuff, it can still feel a little restricting in endgame PvE. Perfect examples is enemies with shields totally neutering this thing, or enemies you can't reliably get as many headshots as you would like. I don't know about you, but I tend to kind of tunnel vision on the last bullet of this thing and forget to actually play the game. Ergo Sum is an exotic that probably doesn't really belong in C tier, but it kind of belongs everywhere or nowhere. I really struggled with the ranking on this one because it completely depends on what you get to drop. For those new to this exotic, it's completely random what you're going to get. Like, I'm talking the actual sword frame, the type of sword that it is, the elemental damage that you're going to do, even the exotic perk is completely random. This thing can be an incredibly strong team buffing weapon like Gallarhorn or Divinity, but then someone else's role can be really, really bad. As it stands, I feel like the ammo reserves aren't quite deep enough to be a true viable option over longer periods in tougher activities. So the current best fit for this is sort of like a buffing exotic with something like the Wolfpack rounds, for example, that you just pull out for a second during a DPS phase. If I was to evaluate that one specific regard, then that'd be way higher up on the list. But because of the random nature of this exotic and many of those roles truly not overtaking other exotics you can use, I'm thinking I gotta leave it here. Okay, that's like 60 down as we head into the B tier where things start to heat up. Anything beyond this point is solid in its own right. They're often seen as build-defined weapons where they have a profound effect when used specifically alongside something else, like an exotic armor piece or an intentional build setup. They're sometimes lovingly called off-meta picks, if you will, but they are real workhorse options reliable in most aspects of the game. Eyes of Tomorrow has incredible potential with it being able to theoretically produce infinite heavy ammo if you can keep the multi-kills rolling. Ironically, it probably just got its best use case in the new Onslaught activity, but the prevalence of frequent heavy ammo crates in that kinda hurts its chances of being a top contender here. Maybe one day, man, you're so close to being great, but you're at the bottom of the top half. Heir Apparent will always surprise you. A 75% damage resist just from aiming down sights while being able to shoot through it makes it super strong, despite it being seen as something of a meme gun. Yeah, I get it, you move slow, but the thing fires at a uniquely, superbly stable 900 RPM. It's naturally just a good pick for harder stationary content that happens to take up an exotic machine gun slot. Just don't get caught reloading the thing. Thunderlord. This thing appeals to a lot of people. You could go as far as saying this is the Taylor Swift of exotics. There's some great music there once you can just get over the fact that you're a Taylor Swift fan at heart. Other people might not get it. They might mock you for bringing that Thunderlord energy at the wrong time, but hey, sometimes you just gotta be that ride or die fan. This thing's fun and it's good. Grand Overture has some unique viability. It's got a property where you're able to actually set up your damage option against immune targets. Like, you can actually get ready for damage during the mechanics section of a boss fight. And when it's time, you just let loose with this huge volley of burst damage and go to town with the rest of what you've got. Some people might argue that this should be in the C tier, but that utility around immunity is a perfectly viable option. Two-Tailed Fox actually puts out some respectable damage if you're the only one using it. It's still largely overshadowed by just coordinating Wolfpack rockets with all of your teammates thanks to Gallarhorn, but if you're more of a solo player, this thing brings a lot of synergies that you can enjoy. There's some better options you'll see in the higher tiers, but seriously, this is a completely viable and perfectly good rocket. Comfortable B tier rating in my opinion. The Jotun is another bit of a meme gun that's genuinely quite good though. It's got great solar subclass synergy with incandescent, and it puts out damage closer to shotgun numbers despite it being a homing missile. I guess it's just unironically very cool to me, and it's such an iconic part of Destiny 2's legacy with the fact that Bungie released a Jotun themed toaster with its logo on it. I'd say this is another one that acquires a taste though. Now, talking about the Lorentz driver, I want my PvP friends to just cover your ears. This exotic gives a lot of players some PTSD because of how busted it was in PvP. But if you're in PvE, it's really nice. The void implosion that pulls enemies in is pretty significant, especially when dealing with enemies that explode after their death. The near permanent 50% damage buff puts it pretty head and shoulders above a lot of other weapons in this similar role. The one thing holding it back, I'd say, is that being a linear fusion, it barely gets champion mod support, so it's just hard to justify using it in locked loadout content, which is why I've held it in the B tier. Ariana's Vow has served a very specific niche for a very long time, and no, it's not fighting barrier champs despite what many people use it for. You can use it for some pretty speedy gameplay, just going around hip firing and one-shotting a lot of enemies, oftentimes with body shots. Because it does have that intrinsic anti-barrier, that means it's perfect for enemies like Cabal or Hive, where they have physical shields that you can just shoot right through for a quick cleanup. It has been taken down a peg by the new rocket sidearms with lower damage output, but I'm still intrigued on how this thing shakes out over the course of Final Shape and beyond. Tessellation is really weird. It feels really close to being extremely good, and with the launch of Prismatic, especially the new Super Song of Flame, all the stars have aligned. You can just spam the charged version, eating endless grenades and firing off railgun shots. The one thing holding it back is the really long animation. Even if you try canceling it early, the amount of time dedicated to charging the gun can feel like a really steep cost to pay. It best shines as something you can prepare for later, so like charging that grenade shot and then stowing it for when you want to insta-delete a larger enemy or group. It's a pretty fun exotic though, so I felt solid about giving it B tier. Collective Obligation. This is one of the good examples of being a build-defined aspect of the B tier. In the right hands, it can be quite good. There's a little bit of buff management, but mainly throwing this on with the Gerfalcon's exotic means you can chain volatile, invisibility, weakening, and leeching buffs over and over. Throw in the fact that you can stow debuffs like weaken and suppress for later, and you wind up with a gun that can do a lot of unique things on demand over the course of a whole activity. Right now, that aspect of storing debuffs isn't quite as valuable, but it definitely has the potential to end up being very strong depending on what sandbox you fall in. A great B tier option. Vex Mythoclast just feels good. While it might be outclassed by Revision 0 in terms of like raw damage potential or anti-barrier capabilities, it benefits from the synergies of being a fusion rifle. That means it gets radiant synergy with the Rain of Fire boots and benefiting from seasonal perks like particle deconstruction. Because of that, when the stars align, it becomes incredibly strong to use, going slightly beyond what an exotic primary should be capable of. Start factoring in the linear shots and you can understand why it becomes a lot of players' favorite. Prometheus Lens isn't that flashy, being that it's primarily a gun just working around incandescent, but it does a good bit more than its legendary counterparts, which is exactly what you want from an exotic. An example is like if you wanted an SMG-like weapon for a solar build that still works at higher levels in the game, it's undeniably one of the best options. It was hugely popular synergizing with the Starfire exotic in the past because the scorch it applies while firing counts for more damage ticks, but when one thing gets directly nerfed, another thing gets indirectly nerfed. Still pretty sweet though. Cold Heart is kind of a funny one because the perk it's famous for is probably the weakest part of the gun. Adding more damage the longer it's sustained on a target is great, but trace rifles have adopted a bit more of a tap fire, run and gun kind of a role. They're best used for picking off weak enemies or for encounter mechanics rather than sustained fire on a big boss. The reason it's still B tier in my opinion though is that this one has adapted to this by allowing ionic traces to charge the gun. The ability to spawn its own traces is pretty amazing for a lot of arc builds. Staying on topic with another trace rifle is the Wave Splitter. This is arguably the second strongest trace rifle in the game. That may or may not have been bait, but we'll find out. Its default damage is naturally higher than its peers and then passively buffs itself on top of that by 70% after picking up an orb. It can be so strong that it's actually the pivotal point of a very popular Void Warlock build that I've explained in other videos in the past. As an example of perfect synergy on a specific build, pairing it with the Verities grenades, you can end up with a maximum uptime on the Wave Splitter buff, making it a super trace, while also exploding enemies everywhere. Even without this though, like just by default, the Wave Splitter does more damage than every other trace for some reason, even without its intrinsic buff. Seriously, if you ever need a void weapon for any reason at all, consider the Wave Splitter. Dead Messenger, the grenade launcher that shoots 3 waves instead of 1 and covers 3 different elements too. The area of effect on this is huge, and it even has like a bit of height to it. It's really impressive. If you're ever playing with something else that auto reloads your guns, like say the transversive steps or maybe the hunter dodge, then you're able to just run around wiping out entire villages in one shot. This exotic is craftable too with the Demolitionist perk. It's an exceptionally strong waveframe if you need one to cover an ad heavy area. Telesto is kind of like a Swiss Army knife. It's good at trapping spawns, mowing down specific enemies, sniping ranged targets. It works well in volatile builds, and it just feels good to use. How does that saying go? Like the jack of all trades, but the master of none? It's not quite the best at any of these things, but the fact that you can do them all at once in one weapon is pretty darn neat. Hierarchy of Needs, the weapon that they made a special Warmind cell interaction for in the past and then immediately moved Warmind cells from the game. It didn't fully rely on it, but it's been left feeling somewhat incomplete as a result ever since. This one's a decent team weapon to use, directly benefiting your teammates that are also running it, allowing you all maximum uptime on the best version of itself using the guidance ring. I kind of struggled with this one because it's great when competing in ranged stationary scenarios, especially how good it can be for cycling through supers. There's a lot of uses as a team above the bottom half in this list, but then it doesn't really outshine when it comes to individual gameplay. The V curve. I'm not saying the first word because I pronounce it wrong every time and then you guys always give me shit. It's a surprisingly good stasis bow. This one does easily outshine some other counterparts like the Strand version Wishkeeper, namely due to its better natural synergy. Simply put, deploying stasis shards with a primary weapon on demand outside of something that requires immediate kills like Headstone is really valuable. The deployment of the stasis crystals is pretty predictable, shattering them still feels great, and it's often seen as a utility item that ramps up at range, giving it a great showing. If you haven't used this, give it a shot, it can be a lot of fun. Necrochasm makes enemies go boom. If you can consistently get the ball rolling with a precision kill, then Necrochasm is actually one of the best at this. If you can't consistently get precision kills, then better options are definitely out there. The one for all buff that it just got makes it really shine too. So much so that I almost moved this up a tier, but I do think the best representation of this is being like one of the absolute top B tier options. Outbreak Perfected is another craftable exotic, and in that state, it is very strong, getting even stronger when your teammates have it as well. The damage it deals scales with the number of active nanites on the target, so the more people using it, the better. In regular play, it feels like a counterpart to Quicksilver Storm, I'll say, where you can focus on smaller targets to then ramp up damage on a larger one. Earlier on, I mentioned how people talk about what primary to bring for their quote-unquote day one damage. Like if they're going to commit to primary ammo in a contest mode or something just really underleveled, this pulse rifle still buzzes as one of the options to use in that case. Revision 0, the exotic pulse rifle with 2 alternate firing modes. 2 rounds or 4 rounds. It's an exceptionally strong option for both anti-barrier and as a hybrid ad-clear single target weapon. If this has been collecting dust for you, I highly recommend you pull it back out and give it a shot after all the buffs that they've given it. I guarantee it'll surprise you. My only issue with this thing is that it takes up like half of the screen. Like the gun model, it just makes it so I can't see so many things. So please, Bungie, could you just move this thing or adjust it somehow? It would go such a long way. The Monte Carlo auto rifle comes with a unique ability to refresh your melee energy on hits. When you're firing a lot of bullets and you're getting a lot of hits, you get a lot of melees. Some might say this is a bit restricted to like solo challenges because of how melee centric it is, but even for regular gameplay, it can be a lot of fun if you have a build with a really fun melee option. Plus, the Catalyst lets you use it like a bayonet. I'm sorry, that's enough to make it into the B tier. All right, let's talk about the Thorn. I love this thing, even in PvE. It holds its own even by itself, but it is incredible when you use it with the Warlock's Necrotic Grips exotic. Stacking those 2 damage over time effects give it insane super energy gains that a lot of people forget about. This is also really great for DPS situations where you're rolling through a bait and switch weapon. When used with the Necrotics, the potential is through the roof regarding ad clear, it's great for bosses, and you can go to like 40 bullets in the mag now. Just a really good pick. I only limited it to the B tier because of that synergy requirement. On a similar note is the Malfeasance. Like some other weapons in this tier, it lives and dies by the exotic pairing. In this case, it's the Hunter's Lucky Pants. This has been a staple for years now, but I still tell people about this because it outputs unbelievable damage when you ramp it up. I was struggling on what to write for this other than just shoot some more, and watch the damage numbers go up. If you're a Hunter main, you pretty much always want to have this in your back pocket with the Lucky Pants. Quicksilver Storm was recently nerfed, so I took it for a good spin to assess the damage. For those wondering, I would say it's more of a sprained ankle than a broken leg. It's still an incredibly strong auto rifle considering the grenade launcher functionality gives it a lot of versatility to a normal, pretty tame archetype. Those nades really do a great deal of damage considering it's a primary, and the immediate AoE on them isn't bad either. Based on the newer playtime so far, it's pretty rare to get those 3 nades from 1 mag now. Like, unless you hit 48 out of the 50 shots, you're not going to get to take full advantage. That being said, it's still one of the most versatile hybrid primaries, if you will, so I think it's a solid B tier. Deku's Divination shines best in high-level content like Grandmaster Nightfalls because of one simple factor: space. The distance at which you are able to track and hipfire onto enemies is slightly absurd, and following up with the ignition style shot afterwards means you can really chunk enemies. Not only that, it's great for clearing entire waves before they even realize you're there. In a team setting, you can even coordinate a rhythm with one person as like a primer and then the other person does the detonating. It's got a pretty unique style of play that starts strong and then it gets better and better with practice the more you use it. I nearly put this in the A tier, but I'd say the one thing holding it back is that the more this game progresses during the seasons, the end game activities become a lot more ability focused than usual, meaning things like this get slightly less utility. Bastion just got a buff and it's very noticeable. I probably would have ranked this in the C tier before Final Shape as a reliable gun for, breaking constructs like those Deep Stone Crypt fuses or maybe Golgoroth Blights. With the launch of Final Shape though, it got a 45% damage buff after a melee kill and faster charge time, plus landing your bursts gives you 1-2 punch. If you're unfamiliar with that, it makes your next melee very lethal. No one's using it for the grapple shenanigans, but these buffs have made it an incredibly strong, unstoppable champion option. The 1-2 punch concept is pretty sweet too for cleaning up enemies without having to wait to kind of do another full burst, like you can just go in between. I recommend you give it a shot. Red Death is a healing pulse rifle that's finally come back from Destiny 1. Get a kill with it and you start to heal. Reload after that kill and you heal your allies. When we get the catalyst in Act 2, or if you're seeing this during Act 2, it heals even more. There's not a whole lot of depth to this. If you like pulse rifles, this is a good one. If you like getting health, this is an option. I'd say it's in direct competition with the legendary No Hesitation auto rifle, so it's up to you what you prefer, but I like it. The Huckleberry mows through ads. It buffs itself to a massive 66% just from getting kills, refills its own magazine when doing so, and then as an exotic primary, it'll pretty much delete any and all trash enemies at any level of content, printing you heavy ammo bricks as you go along. Nothing too fancy here, just a very strong, reliable SMG that is probably the best at what it does. I will say that SMGs aren't in like the hottest spot right now for PvE, but hey, I stand by the Huckleberry. That wraps up the B tier, and now it's time for A tier. These guns are exceptional. They're weapons with very relevant uses in the current meta and among the best at what they do specifically. I might even end up sounding like I'm describing S tier items, but the defining factor is how often or widely you can use them regardless of situation. Many of these can dominate 95% of the game, certainly better than prior mentions, but then they risk flattening out in the harder 5%, so it'll become clear as we transition into S tier afterwards. The Lament remains as one of the most dependable, high damage swords at our disposal. Even for general use, regaining health on hits is an incredibly strong perk, and ignoring barrier shields while you're at it is like a cherry on top. With the Lament, you almost never have to worry about weird synergies or positioning perfectly for surrounded buffs. You just rev this thing up and cut them down. Legend of Acarius is one of the highest damage options in the game. A lot of people forget about it, and maybe it's because you have to be really close to a boss, not have the risk of getting stomped like crazy, and have a long enough period of time that you get to shoot this thing over and over. With the Catalyst, you're getting a 50% buff from Trench Barrel, so if you can use it properly, it's one of the simplest damage options out there, so don't forget this when it comes to any bosses that you can get up close to. Parasite, an exceptionally strong burst damage option used in encounters where you have both a very small window of time to deal damage and plenty of adds around them to warm up on beforehand. Because the size and damage of the explosion scales with the number of enemies you've defeated just before firing it, the potential is amazing, and the fact that it benefits from a solar holster mod makes it unique across all grenade and rocket launcher frames. Every other second, you can fire off a giant worm either for hilariously good ad clear or as part of an optimized damage rotation. Anarchy is an exotic that lives in infamy as one of Destiny 2's greatest guns. It's been struggling to build up as much steam after a few rounds of nerfs, the loss of Starfire Protocol being a widespread option, and then the fact that the game has been naturally shifting towards easier high damage options like Gallarhorn rockets. Every so often, however, something pops up that requires a damage over time option, or something to effectively plug spawn points while you go about the rest of that encounter. When that happens, Anarchy is your best friend because it's the best at what it does. Tractor Cannon is something that you kind of can't really overstate how strong it is. As the only 30% debuff in the game, dedicating a player to Tractor Cannon duty becomes almost essential for many boss encounters that you want to take seriously. The Tractor Cannon user can make or break teams in contest scenarios, and with a good one often being what drives the whole team to victory. It's not applicable in all areas of the game though, and I think that's what holds it here in A tier, despite being also great at ad clear. The suppression it gives is insanely overpowered, but I know a lot of people are still playing solo out there, and it's largely reserved for only a couple of subclasses in that case. I was really torn, but I'm sticking with A tier. Whisper of Worm is our next exotic, and at the time of writing this, it is the second highest sustained DPS exotic in the entire game. One divinity and 5 other whispers will basically crush anything as long as it's got a longer damage phase. With its now incredibly large reserve pools, you can also worry less about the ammo dependency scenario in later phases. Simply put, it's very good at that specific role of longer damage phases. A bit of a one-trick pony, but incredible at that. The Xenophage exotic was favored for a long time because it was a 0 crit easy mode option for a lot of bosses. Couple it with something like Actium War Rig and you could just hold down the trigger, calling it a day. I still love that they call it a machine gun, and the area of effect is huge, almost to the extent that it's sort of like holding a rapid fire rocket. It makes it a great option for clearing groups of enemies with set spawn points, like take Onslaught for example, where coordinated teams can just mow through waves with huge amounts of reserves. Always a great option in my opinion. Sleeper Simulant is like easy mode. If I ever have someone who's new to the game that kind of struggles with DPS rotations or anything like that, I just tell them to put this on. You can incorporate it into some builds where there aren't as many like ammo opportunities. It feels really hard to miss with this thing, and it's just overall a super comfortable choice to do big crit damage and look okay compared to your friends on the DPS charts. Dragon's Breath is basically a final form of what I like to call passive damage. You shoot a rocket at something to deal damage on a direct hit, but this one gives a lot of additional passive damage along the way. It's a bit tricky to optimize because you need to pay attention to things like how often you scorch the boss, the ignitions you've created, or whether or not it's reloaded itself on time, but a lot of the beauty comes around dealing that damage in the background while you're shooting your other weapons. I'd say it primarily works best on solar subclasses, and although there is a learning curve to it, if you get the hang of it to use it optimally, man, Dragon's Breath is straight fire. Leviathan's Breath, I could probably say is similar to Whisper of the Worm or the Sleeper Simulant that I just talked about, where it's just very simple. You aim it and you shoot it. If you're hitting crits, whether it's a regular headshot or maybe on a divinity bubble, you're going to be doing a lot of damage. It can do more DPS than Whisper with lower reserves, assuming you've got the timing just right on when to shoot it. Outside of boss damage, it's also found a nice niche against unstoppable champions. The first hit does that small amount needed to trigger the champion's stun, and then the huge explosion afterwards does the bulk of the damage. Vostov is the new hotness, and it's getting a lot of love right now for a good reason. First of all, it sounds like you're shooting paint cans in the backyard. Does anyone else notice that? It's just something about that sound. One popularity around it is just how stable it is compared to basically all other auto rifles in the game, and it holds up well against the latest enemy types like Grims. The shoot to loot perk I will always stand by, and then some really strong ricochets directly from getting orbs. This thing becomes a really strong workhorse that people of all skill levels can get behind and enjoy. Luminarch performs exceptionally well at the GM level, providing a really easy solution to overloads, which are typically more difficult to manage than the other champion types for most people. One Luminarch on the team can keep an overload at bay for basically forever, and even outside of that role, it still makes for great ranged ad clear with the splash damage. Pair it with volatile rounds, and this thing is up there as a contender for one of the best default Grandmaster Nightfall options. Buried Bloodline, the exotic that gives you access to Devour regardless of subclass. It's one of very few tools that can do this, making it uniquely strong for survival. As a result, this has been used in a few areas where people have soloed raid bosses. On top of that, while Devour is active, it gives the weaken debuff on your hit. In easier content, this fills the role of Ariana's Vow, being able to just run and gun, cleaning up individual ads while hip firing, except it has a much bigger reserves pool. Because it's technically a sidearm too, you'll find yourself printing heavy bricks like crazy. Graviton Lance, the long-range sunshot creating explosions everywhere and with a sound of beauty. I mean, just listen to this thing. It clears out enemies so easily at range, and it's a good example of an exotic that can dominate 95% of the content out there, but mainly struggles with being a pulse rifle. When something gets too close to you in very high level content, you can struggle. The kill chaining explosions are insane though when it gets going, and this thing deserves the A tier rating. Risk Runner's whole thing is that it helps you be unkillable with some damage increase. When you read the actual perk, I feel like it's kind of undersold. So let me make it clear. Every time you take arc damage, you will then take 50% less damage from those arc things for the next 6 seconds. That will then stack with any other damage resistance you have, whether it be resilience, maybe the chest armor mods, woven mail, and so on. The secret here is you don't even need to have the Risk Runner out for this to work. When you're dealing with arc heavy content, it's unbelievable without even needing to use it. The survival benefits are incredibly unique, and that utility earns it a rightful slot in this section. Merciless, the exotic that can output a dumb amount of damage. When there's an enemy nearby that you can kill before a DPS phase, it's hilarious how strong it is. Some people will definitely argue that outside of that one case, it's more reserved, but the sheer transformation that one setup does simply cannot go unnoticed. Once you get the hang of activating this thing properly, you will fall in love with it. Divinity. You know, that one exotic that everyone raises their hand to use during a DPS phase. The one that puts a big bubble out there for all your teammates like you're the real hero. In a prior season, I probably would have ranked this S tier, but I have to be very careful in respecting the options that are in that section. With the debuff on this being reduced to the weakened level and still needing to dedicate nearly 100% of someone's damage to using this weak trace rifle has hurt it. It's a very strong A tier option, and that's really the one thing that holds it back. The fourth horseman is an exotic that you can just turn off your brain, run up to an enemy, hold down the trigger, and watch it die. It fires at insane speed, and each subsequent shot, meaning the next one afterwards, increases in damage. If you're landing every shot, which you will be since you're up close, those final shots are going to hit really hard. The fourth horseman is uniquely qualified as an extra burst damage option in many cases, or as a way to get a specific enemy off the field right away when you need to. Osteostriga, like the Thorn, benefits immensely from the Warlock Necrotic Grips exotic. Unlike Thorn, however, it gets a lot of that functionality by itself. Just playing mindlessly, it's common that you're going to end up with 100 bullets in the mag while enemies continue ticking away behind you. You get super gains from all those damage ticks, an ability to consistently stun enemies when you have an overload SMG, and then the fact it behaves well beyond its intended range bracket makes it an easy S tier pick in all levels of content. Those are all things that I would have said until its latest nerf. The Poison Splash is now on a 4-second cooldown and with no visual indicator to tell you that it won't even activate. It's still great for damage over time, but it genuinely belongs behind the Thorn down in the B tier now. I know we're in the A tier section right now, but this is a brand new change, and I have a sneaking suspicion Bungie's going to realize all of this and walk it back a bit. I'm placing my bet. The Navigator is interesting as it's had some use at the top level GM play out there. I'd be doing it a disservice not mentioning the synergy it brings with this cool looking exotic regarding woven mail, but honestly, even at base, it's fascinating. The fact it can shoot a grapple point for you means classes like Titans and Warlocks don't need 2 grenades to be able to spam that grapple. We all want to be like Spider-Man, and this becomes a great traversal tool. This thing is definitely considered a utility weapon, but it is very valuable in many cases, and there's a big reason you see it on every Strand Titan who wants to solo stuff. Microcosm is really interesting. Exotic perks aside, just being a heavy trace rifle puts it quite high up. It fills a similar role to that of Thunderlord, I'd say. It's basically just a gun that you can hold the trigger down for a long time and deal damage. This thing feels really potent though against tougher enemies like Tormentors, and it synergizes better with Transcendence due to its kinetic nature. I'm gonna have to see how it holds up over time, but it's currently a pretty popular pick. Wishender is the exotic where everyone reminds you that it's better than Arbalest for Grandmaster Barrier champs. Before its buff, Arbalest was the only gun capable of this, and then they just slapped this effect on a primary weapon that is Wishender. It probably does more than it should considering it's a primary, especially because the super gains scale with the damage ticks, meaning you get way more energy when using it on beefier targets. But at the top end, people still do run Arbalest. I'm not entirely convinced that this is an S tier pick, but it's definitely a strong A tier. Lumina is an exotic hand cannon that lets you buff yourself and your teammates' damage by an enormous 35% for basically nothing. Like, just to be clear here, it's a pretty decent hand cannon at base, and then as long as you get a couple of kills before an encounter, you're ready to rip for your entire team. Like, that is a really low barrier of entry to get a crazy good team-wide buff. Plus, I mean, look at this. This is just wonderful. It takes some practice at first, but once you get the timing down, it's addicting. Okay, Forerunner. This thing is very slept on. I know everyone talks about it for PvP, but it just naturally does some pretty crazy crit damage, and the ammo economy is really good for this gun of its strength. I think a lot of people feel like it's unintuitive in most activities, but if you're needing to put in a lot of regular headshot damage, it's undeniably strong. I really didn't know what else to write other than please give this a shot. Izanagi's Burden. This thing hits like a truck if it had a rocket propelled to the back of it. If you can hit your shot, that is. There's a reason it's been a staple for endgame players for as long as it's been around. I mean, 4 bullets in 1, what else can you ask for? But the main question between A versus S, for example, is the widespread application. Is it the best at what it does? Yes. Is it incredibly annoying, however, when you're low on ammo or in a place where you can't reliably place down a rally flag? Yes. Euphony is a perfect example of a gun being exceptionally strong among the best at what they do and only being limited by things like your build selection. That restriction had me wondering where to put this, but it absolutely cooks once you get it going. Reaching a point where you've piled up a ton of threadlings on enemies through your abilities or with sustained fire, and you'll see what I mean. As a general use gun, I'd say it's just fine. Like, it's good. 3 burst linears are great, and this is our first special version. But yeah, the main reason I've got it this high is that once you get those damage stacks going from the threadling spam, it's a freaking monster. Just look at this clip as an example. Full credit to Zemo. With the A tier wrapped up, we are finally up to the S tier. Think of these as having all the positives in previous tiers, but with the important distinction that they can hang in basically every facet of the game. They can often have exceptional niche use cases while still being worth the exotic slot for any general use across all of your gameplay. They don't have major drawbacks that I've explained in previous tiers, and they're not really outclassed by other things out there. They're also easy to bring into pretty much any activity you want. So let's dive in, starting with the Trinity Ghoul. This thing's a monster. In basically all strikes, dungeons, and raids, Trinity Ghoul will one-shot almost all red bars without you even needing to aim or fully draw the bow. Something like this is often necessary, and it can do it from like 73 miles away. Then again, it also does the exact same thing at point blank. You fire it at the floor, and some buffed up lightning takes out a whole wave of ads. Get a kill with it, which you will, and you get to do it again. Over and over, you can just do this forever with practically no input required from you as a player. Frankly, it's kind of insane how good this has been for how long. Conditional Finality is something special. Considering it's probably the best shotgun in PvP, while also being able to dominate PvE is amazing. Because this thing can work as solar and stasis, it can trigger either a freeze or an ignition, which work for certain champion counters, and viable damage output. On the ignition side, you get explosions that help you clear waves of ads, and then if you run a solar or stasis holder, you're able to fire off that ignition every other second as part of a damage rotation too. Conditional Finality is a truly beautifully designed exotic, and I tip my hat to Bungie for doing it. It works for so many players regardless of their level of skill, and is easily deserving of its place this high on the list. Ager's Scepter, the absolute king for a stasis build. Being a trace rifle, it has enormous reserves, and I think I made fun of trace rifle damage earlier on, but by default, this one does the top end damage per shot. Each kill will then activate like an insta-freeze with a huge radius. Shattering just one of those frozen targets will then usually kill all of the rest. It's truly some of the most fun gameplay you can have, like just tickle a thrall with a few shots and then bam, the whole wave around them is frozen. Now, while this is the king of stasis builds, it still works great on any other subclass too, so you get the essence of freezing with whatever other build you enjoy most. I don't think this is slept on, but I'm interested to see how many people would have ranked it S tier. Let's talk about Arbalist. Most people talk about how this works on anti-barrier champs, but did you know that it can one-shot any shield in the game? Like, it doesn't matter how much HP or damage requirement there is on the shield. If you use Arbalist, one shot and it's gone. It's such a cool mechanic, and a perfect example of that is in the Ghosts of the Deep dungeon, where you usually have to do around 600,000 damage just to break that boss's immunity shield. Or one person on the team can just hit it with Arbalist and you're good to go. With respect to a DPS window, this is a big deal. Pair that that with the intrinsic anti-barrier option, the fact that it's special ammo, and you've got a potent A tier option. Witherhoard is amazing. I talked earlier about how Anarchy was a fan favorite when it comes to dealing damage over time. When this got introduced to the game, it kind of cemented itself in that role. It's got utility as an ad clear monster when you put it in a spawn point or a doorway. It's become very meta defining when dealing with boss damage, and just all around useful. To be clear about that boss thing, it's because you're able to just shoot this and directly stick a boss, then activate perks like bait and switch, subclass setups that gain ability energy from dealing damage ticks over time. Hell, it's even got a niche synergy to buff the OmFiscient exotic from before. If you're running Witherhoard and they're running that, you hit the enemy first and they can deal 25% more damage. This is another one where I could probably go down a rabbit hole of use cases, but honestly, overall it's just insanely fun to use and a must-have option. Okay, Still Hunt runs dangerously close to what I defined the A tier as, being that it fills one role specifically well. I had a tough time with this one because it struggles to find a meaningful usage across all the classes in like all the activities. On one hand, you could say it runs parallel to Izanagi, but honestly, in its current form, it's just another beast. I'll say right away that this thing is absolutely juiced when it's on Hunter, but even when you have Titans running it to have a golden gun for damage, those lines start to blur. The beauty here is that it ignores all of the setup that comes with other guns like say the Grand Overture, because this, you can just get a full golden gun on the rally. It's incredibly relevant for the current raid from Final Shape, but then it is just a great standalone sniper too. I don't know if I'm a little early on placing this in the S tier because it could see a nerf coming its way, but man, right now it just breaks the rules and belongs here. Now that's actually it for the S tier, and in theory we're at the top and we should be done. But there's two more weapons to discuss. These are guns that are so clearly out of band in my opinion that even representing them as S tier is not enough. I'm officially adding an S+ tier just for these two, so let's get into them, starting with the Sunshot. This exotic hand cannon has been one of the best in the game since the very first day it arrived, which happens to be the game's launch. Even as hand cannons wavered in popularity for PvE, Sunshot remained the strongest choice available. Its very archetype of shooting at 150 RPM was even removed from the game, leaving Sunshot the only of its kind. Then when Bungie decided to buff hand cannons in Season 23, the awareness of this thing's strength suddenly caught public attention, if you will, and everyone kind of just realized, holy shit, why did I ever stop using it? For a while now, Bungie has been focusing on trying to get people to use primaries more often, thereby buffing them to encourage it. There's a lot of primaries that I've talked about today, but Sunshot just, man, did it take that by storm. Some of the most intense activities, like soloing something on the highest difficulty, you'll often see Sunshot. The best part about this is that the way to describe it is you shoot things and they blow up. That's it. It's like a recipe where it's just this perfect magical mix of everything, whether it's the precise damage output combined with the rate of fire, the fact it's an absolute stat monster with the catalyst, how buttery smooth it feels to play with, exotics that it can pair with, aspects and fragments that it can enable, the benefits of being a primary constantly getting buffed by Bungie, and realistically having the widest use case capability across many years of content. I swear by this thing, just not in PvP. And with the 121 exotics done, there is one that remains, the everlasting Gjallarhorn. Possibly the most famous weapon of all time, not only of just this game, but the entire franchise. Even without its prior legacy of D1, the introduction of Wolfpack rounds for your whole team completely changed the game's ecosystem. Almost all team activities are dominated by groups making sure they have one person on galley so that every other rocket launcher gets Wolfpack rounds for boss damage. This goes for all skill levels too, which is special if you think about it. Anyone can feel a part of the contribution if they use it, and heck, people sometimes dedicate their entire build around heavy ammo because of this thing. The one drawback of dealing much less individual damage versus your teammates is completely outweighed by the extra damage they get to do thanks to you. Even for solo use though, it's fantastic for ad clear no matter what distance you're shooting from, with the fact that it'll split into tracking rounds anyway. The world record for almost every single lost sector in the game is held by a warlock using Gjallarhorn. Certain Grandmaster Nightfalls are speedrun in 5 minutes, not by abusing exploits, but by drowning them with this thing. A recent bonus is that Bungie just buffed its reserves too, and after nearly 2.5 years since it came back to Destiny 2, I would argue it's been buzzing around the top the entire time. Ultimately, if you were to ask any Destiny 2 player 10 years from now what weapon they remember most from the game, it's Gjallarhorn. With my voice being completely gone now, I'm going to call that a wrap, but I'd like to thank you for watching as well as my community for being a part of this video, coming up with a lot of the fun footage in the background. Thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring the project. Make sure to click on the link in my pinned comment because this video would not be possible without that help, and enjoy the free bonus package including that Eagle of Valor decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account. To anyone looking for a to-do list on what the best weapons you should chase first, including legendaries, I've linked that on screen for you to watch next.